Okay, the anti-communist front, though, was very broad, and it had the mainstream Democrats were firmly part of it. We were in a war in Korea for a lot of this time, and the main limiting thing was we couldn't go to war with China. It was considered that it was untenable to fight the Chinese, especially after they crossed the Yalu River and counterattacked Douglas MacArthur. So there was a problem, which was that the committee, this is a Senate Select Committee that was investigating this stuff, wanted to go after communists in the labor unions. And what RFK, who's in the picture here, who was on the committee, who went to the funeral for Tail Gunner Joe, he found that there was other problems in the labor movement, such as the Teamsters was totally infiltrated by the mafia. So he decided to take the investigation. They were investigating a union in Wisconsin, and the owners of this plant in Appleton or something, or up by Oshkosh, had put machine guns on top of the plant. They were really paranoid about the union, and they wanted a real witch hunt against the union. Instead, Kennedy went off and did this, which is a whole book about the mafia in America. And you have to understand that J. Edgar Hoover said there was no mafia. There is no commission. There is no Cosa Nostra. And the only person who believed there was a mafia was Harry Anslinger for the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. So in a weird way, RFK and them were aligning with Anslinger against some of their own people, because this is the person that they really targeted, this man named Sam Giancana. It's recorded that RFK really didn't like this guy's laugh. He found it very irritating. And Giancana was not a very cooperative witness. But see, he was part of the Democratic establishment in Chicago. And this became very important in the history of the election, because here you have the debate, the first big televised debate between presidential candidates, and Kennedy won it hands down. Nixon was tired and hungover. Turned out Nixon was a prodigious drinker. And Kennedy was on some kind of a Dr. Feelgood regimen, so he had plenty of energy. And after that, the girls all started treating him like he was a movie star. Just narrowly won the election, and won the election based on votes in Chicago that the Republicans always claimed were stolen by Giancana and these people. Well, Giancana and these people, they figured they were owed. But what happened under the Kennedy White House, lots of stuff that nobody expected to really happen. They really came out against the Klan, and they really came out and sent the troops out to enforce desegregation more than the Republicans. See, this had been, until kind of the Roosevelt Republicans took over, the Democrats had this southern wing that kept them from doing anything like that. And the Republicans had Frederick Douglass, really famous black abolitionist, as part of the original coalition. In fact, when they passed the Civil Rights Law, it was passed with a lot of Republican votes. And the thing that changed was the Democrats. The Democrats became more liberal than now on this issue. And it had repercussions, as the presidency of John Kennedy, kind of unwrapped, as people got to really see what he was doing. And this is a very interesting thing that the Kennedys did on marijuana, because this was a guy who was targeted. He was not part of the government like Harris Isbell, and when he said the same thing that Harris Isbell said, that the real problem is hard drugs and that marijuana is benign, in the introduction to a bunch of other people's essays, Harry Anslinger decided to destroy his academic career. He was in Indiana, and he was going to be fired, but instead what happened was the Kennedys, and both Kennedys, Robert and John, smoked pot. But the Kennedys forbade it and then removed Harry Anslinger from actual police authority and made an ambassador to the UN, where he put in the single convention. And I'll have a thing on that later. But Alfred Lindesmith became the inspirator of Ethan Nadelman, who called his organization the Lindesmith Institute. So that was the end of the actual reign of Anslinger, and he ended up still having a lot of influence, but the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was found to be almost to the man completely corrupt, and it was dissolved. A lot of those guys were prosecuted, and a new organization called the BNDD was formed under the Justice Department, Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. Now, here's Kennedy in his brace. He was a medical marijuana patient. My friend Les Ledbetter was a young man, about 19. He became a White House intern as a gesture to the support of the black community. He was a black kid. His father was an influential black minister, and his job was to go out and get the bottle of liquor or the bag of weed. And he said that it was commander-in-chief quality, right? The weed he was getting for JFK. Whether that is true or not, JFK had really bad back pain, and he needed to do medical marijuana and a number of other things all of his life. And now they're saying that the back pain, he couldn't react in time to the bullet, to move out of the way of the bullet, because he was gussing it up like this, and he couldn't move right. See, there he is at the UN. This is Anslinger, the older Anslinger, at the UN. The Single Convention made marijuana illegal in every country. And it didn't immediately come into force. I was just in Nepal, and they told me that the United States came around and insisted that they get rid of this traditional plant that the sadhus use in religious worship in 1975. And a lot of places, it wasn't until the 70s that they got pushed by the U.S. State Department, regardless of what was happening, with the state of opinion in the United States about marijuana. The State Department was consistently anti-marijuana the entire time. And you go to these other people, like I've been to Vienna for the annual Committee on Narcotics, Drugs, and I went in and I could tell you that there was this unbelievably big auditorium with all kinds of countries across the bottom of the seats, and they were all had maintenance narcotics, maintenance opiates as their program. That's the only program they have for the world, and that's the only program they have for the United States, because Chris Christie was a pretty reactionary guy and does not want to admit there is no gateway effect. He's still pumping out the gateway effect. So we know there's a 25% drop in heroin ODs in states that have legalized pot, but somehow that hasn't made it into like Chris Christie's worldview yet. So this is they're still channeling Harry Anslinger from beyond the grave. But see, the real problem was that the Bay of Pigs led to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the Cuban Missile Crisis led to détente. And they started talking to each other. And actually, for a short period of time, for 2 years, these two guys had a good rapport with each other. And they were able to do things like neutralizing Laos. Well, the CIA, the various factions of the CIA did not really trust Kennedy because his father, Joe Kennedy, had been supposedly an appeaser. He was not an appeaser. He believed in containment, which actually became the United States policy when Russia was involved in 1947. Might not have worked against Adolf Hitler at all anyway, but the point is, 2 of Joe Kennedy's kids died in that war. The one that was supposed to be Senator, Joseph Kennedy, died in that war. And so, the reluctance to go to war is reasonable, right? Until you're attacked, which we were. Maybe it's best to stay out of wars. But they didn't trust Kennedy, and they didn't trust him because he didn't bomb Cuba against the, when the exiles were on the beach. He didn't, drop bombs on Castro. And they thought that he would not be a reliable person in Vietnam because he neutralized Laos. And that becomes important a little bit later. Now, this is kind of some of the stuff that was happening right around this period of time. And this has to be emblematic of a bunch of other things that Ginsburg did. But these were the first avant-garde legalization demonstrations. And as you can see, there's some people in the picture on the right. There's some people above Ginsburg's hand. So he had some other people with him. And they were probably pretty straight-looking people. Even though that they were hipsters, they were not yet hippies. They didn't have long hair. They looked remarkably like, professors, maybe a liberal college. And to get back a little bit, in 1943, LSD was discovered. And in the 50s, LSD became a big fad among psychiatrists who were giving it in the United States to people in Hollywood to resolve their complexes. Gordon Wasson did a thing in Life magazine about mushrooms. And Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs went to the Amazon in search of Yagé. And they were looking for the holy grail of the beatnik movement, which was a drug that would wipe out heroin addiction. And they weren't really so far off because even today the Santo Daime Church, which is the ayahuasca church, and Yagé is ayahuasca, claims that doing this concoction of two plants for both DMT and harmaline gets them off of alcohol mostly, right? Mostly the problem drug in the world for the average consumer is alcohol, and about 10% of people who drink way too much. And so he gets, Anslinger gets on, or no, excuse me, Ginsburg gets on Merv Griffith and says that pot is fun, and says that pot should be legal. And it's the first time anybody has had the guts to say this. And Anslinger targets him, but can't get anything on him because Ginsburg is too paranoid. On the other hand, when Howard Lotsof came to Ginsburg at Peace Eye Bookstore in 1963 and tells him about Ibogaine, it doesn't really register because the person that was really interested in that was Burroughs, and Burroughs just wasn't there. So Ginsburg goes on and becomes a really good friend of RFK after the assassination of Kennedy. But by the time I met him, he was off more into no nukes than he was into pot. He'd been a big pot guy, but a lot of these guys had momentary passions, and then after a couple years they would wane and they would get into something else. So it took a while to get a pot movement going that would stay focused on pot, number one, and not change with the season. And number two, would be passionate and articulate and consistent and recruit, large numbers of people, which is necessary to have a movement. But this is a really interesting, I think culturally, because Sam Kinison. Anybody remember Sam Kinison?
Yeah.
Sam Kinison says that Kennedy was assassinated because he smoked pot and fucked Marilyn Monroe. But I just saw a thing today on the bottom of some webpage about her love affair with JFK. So it's still alive as speculation. And obviously, the right-wing kind of like blue noses, they would be really upset that they're not fucking Marilyn Monroe. They're just jealous, See, now look at the size of this cake. You can tell that the Republican right wing was extremely upset by the size of the cake. There was nobody who was ever as popular as JFK, They had to kill him, or they would have been in power forever, because it was him, and then his brother, and then his brother, right? So they would have stopped being president around 1980 or something. A long time. But here is what happened, of course, and the inset. You know that the people in the inset, but the outset are the three bums being led away from the grassy knoll. And the question is the man in the middle there, right above Frank Sturgis, which Harvey Oswald, Frank Sturgis in a slight disguise, combed his hair differently and is trying to look as discreet as possible, hustling away from a job. And there's basically been two theories about the Kennedy assassination. JFK did it, or rather LBJ did it, or Richard Nixon did it. Well, I will say that because Richard Nixon was considered to be the rightful president by the conspirators, whoever they were, because anybody from the broad thing of the Republican Party, this is Vince Foster or something, right? They believe that that Kennedy ripped off the election in 1960, that they're never going to let go of that. So they kind of think he got what he deserved. What really happened, of course, is it had more to do with the neutralization of Laos. But there's people who believe that there's a deathbed statement of E. Howard Hunt where he admits he did it. So you figure it out. Anyway, there was some interesting stuff that happened in the aftermath. LBJ said, let us continue. And they forced the conservative, segregationist Democrats in the Senate to allow the passage of civil rights legislation, to commemorate JFK. And what happened was these three guys went missing. It was Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner. And they couldn't find them. And so J. Edgar Hoover brings the mafia. Remember, the mafia doesn't exist. He brings a guy down from Brooklyn or Detroit or something, and puts him in the back room with the Grand Dragon of the KKK. And they got the location of the three bodies by having a mafioso beat the crap out of the KKK. And interestingly enough, the KKK became kind of it. Like the communists had been it. Like you're in a game, who's it, right? You're a kid, who's going to be it in the hide and seek and stuff. And it went from being like everybody was going after communists to they're going to decimate the KKK. And that, like, my father was a kind of a Democratic Party operative. And he was in the American Legion, and he got a introduction, or a resolution introduced to ban them from veterans organizations. So, but the thing was, by this time, J. Edgar Hoover is very old, and the anti-communist thing has waned because it's the middle of the 60s, and it just, people are now, Edward Murrow did, these things denouncing. The guy who broadcast from London during the Blitz does the whole thing against, like, McCarthyism. It's doomed. Well, every time the country lurches to the right, there are these assassinations. And you can't really say there's a direct causal link. It's more like correlation does not prove causality. But there is correlation. So both these guys get assassinated, and the assassination of King leads to the Black Panthers. The assassination of RFK eliminates somebody who said on national television a month earlier that marijuana is less harmful than cigarettes, and was probably going to reopen the JFK assassination, and was going to go to Chicago and stop the war in Vietnam. The result was the Yippies went to Chicago and did a demonstration. They were ready to call off if RFK was nominated. And when Hubert Humphrey got in, the whole Yippie demonstration was kind of reevaluated or evaluated because it was happening. It wasn't really time to but it was evaluated as a riot. When the only thing that happened was people smoking in the pot in the park are going to lead cops in some jurisdictions to really try to smash the demonstration. And we were trying to do this lifestyle demonstration, but also be against the war. And we did not necessarily win over many anti-war Democrats with that. What happened was, very narrowly, Richard Nixon was elected, and Abbie Hoffman, always to his dying day, got really upset if you blamed him for electing Richard Nixon, but in some ways he did. Now, the reason I'm bringing up this man is not the whole thing about LSD, that LSD really went nationwide around 1966, 65, started being used by a lot of people who weren't in a CIA experiment or in Hollywood with a psychiatrist, just taking it at like concerts and stuff. And they had these electric Kool-Aid acid tests. I think they had some of them in L.A. But Hugh Romney, or Wavy Gravy, in fact, I think, was in charge of the one in L.A. The narcs sent 6 narcs to observe and came back and said, we got to arrest this because people are getting high. So you have to understand is, when it was heroin and cocaine, people were getting addicted. Marijuana gave them the jurisdiction over just people getting high. So if marijuana could be banned, that opened the door to banning LSD, which had tremendous therapeutic potential, and they didn't care. And in New York City, first person ever busted for acid LSD conspiracy was Howard Lotsof. And Howard Lotsof told them at the trial, they mocked him and said, you say you're a legitimate researcher, what did you ever discover? He said, I discovered that ibogaine stops heroin and cocaine addiction. This is 1965. The judge slams down the gavel, clears the courtroom, and then 10 minutes later instructs the jury to disregard that last comment, that they never heard it. And he ends up going to prison, in federal prison for 18 months. And while he's in prison and can't tell anybody about his discovery, they pass a supplemental order in the federal registrar, right, banning DMT, toad licking, and ibogaine, because they'd missed some stuff. They got mescaline and LSD, psilocybin, but they missed some stuff. So they, and basically nobody commented because nobody knew that this stuff has this potent anti-addiction effect. So it passed into law without comment in November of 1967. Timothy Leary sent a message back to Howard Lotsof saying, this stuff will never be a party drug. And it's true. You basically take ibogaine and you just want to lay down. That's, you get kind of car sick and you just got to lay down. So, Timothy Leary, of course, had a different aspect. He didn't necessarily want to do what Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs did. They figured, we'll attack right at the point of addiction. We'll find something like ibogaine that works right at the addiction, and this will change the economics of the drug scene, because you won't have these people who are strung out on smack exploiting the pot movement, which is when I got into dealing pot. That's what we found. There were a certain number of people who were important to the dealing infrastructure, who had heroin, and everybody was doing coke, but they had heroin problems, and that was really what it meant was that you were paying a tax. You couldn't have cheap pot because somebody was taking a bunch of money out. And the problem with doing heroin, of course, is that your tolerance keeps going up and up and up. It's called a dose-response curve, and it's no good. So there was a split, and these guys basically wanted to just mass apply LSD to the world. There was a guy named Nicky Sands who made 35 million doses of orange sunshine. And it was not enough to change the world, because the world, of course, has billions of people in it. Whereas you could actually have an effect on a much more narrow subset of people if you could come up with a cure for heroin. But Timothy Leary was busted going over the bridge in El Paso in 1969. And or maybe a little bit earlier than that, because I think they actually did the Supreme Court decision on his case in 1969, and they threw out, he is the first guy to challenge the constitutionality of the Tax Stamp Act. And of course it's unconstitutional because of double jeopardy. You have to say I'm doing something illegal, right? There was no federal law against marijuana for almost 2 years. There was just nothing on the books. They couldn't get it together to pass something again. And so whatever you say about Timothy Leary, he really had an impact on pot. This is Lester Grinspoon. And Nixon is on the tapes saying to Henry Kissinger, what's wrong with those Jews, those Jewish psychiatrists? Why are they, not boosting my anti-drug crusade? Why are they calling into question psychiatry by being pro-pot? They can't do that. And Lester Grinspoon said, Rick Cusick, a note that he got from guys, I guess the interns in the White House, Dick Cheney and them, sent a message saying, Richard Nixon knows who you are and he's going to get you and put you on the enemy's list. So it was quite irritating that he brought out the book Marijuana Reconsidered and basically laid out all the same stuff all over again that was in the LaGuardia report, except better. He did a better job. Now here, this is again, stuff from the Nixon tapes, and he said the key to devise a system that recognizes the fact that you're going after black people and you're specifically targeting them to be imprisoned without appearing to be, you've got to appear to be race neutral. And of course they do it by having certain areas that are designated high crime areas where, ordinary laws about search and seizure don't apply. And the other thing, of course, was that Ehrlichman made the comment that we knew the laws against drugs, especially the laws against marijuana, were complete rubbish. But we wanted to go after the peaceniks smoking pot and tie them together with the blacks using heroin and be able to bust up their meetings and put them in prison. This was taken as a great revelation when it came out under Obama. But if you were there at the time, you already knew that. The first thing that happened was that they put in Operation Intercept down around San Diego way, and they were really stopping, they had literally hippie girls with ponchos, right, bringing a couple, this girl would appear to be a little bit fat, right, but she would have keys, we call them keys, right, kilos, right, they were shaped rectangle, mini Beal. And she would put them under her poncho and just walk across the border every day, bringing a regular flow, right? And all these scams, of course, were terminated. And we noticed that what was happening was the pot was being replaced by something else, usually a lot more negative as a drug, often heroin. And what we didn't know was, of course, the stuff about the CIA heroin. That only came out a little later. That came out, by 71. See, I got to explain what happened here. This is Tom Forssad and Abby Hoffman at the trial where they are supposed to be reaching a resolution about the Steal This Book matter. Abby Hoffman gave all the money from Steal This Book to the Panther 21, leaving no $3,000 to pay Tom. He should have paid Tom. Tom never would have started the Zippies. In 1967, in Tompkins Park, at Memorial Day, the police arrested the Warrior Sisters League for having a picnic on the grass, which was not weed. It was just they were having a picnic on the grass on Hummings Hill. And they dragged a woman up, visibly pregnant, across an iron fence, which enraged many of the local Latin American gentlemen who were very protective of women because of their culture. And so a mixed posse of hippies and local Puerto Ricans went over and was conducting a really vigorous protest in front of the 9th Precinct, which is at 5th and 1st Avenue. AJ and I were finishing up doing mescaline, and we're walking up 1st Avenue, and we saw this thing and got involved. A lot of people came in the next couple of days from the burbs to support, feeling that they were supporting something. And then there were kind of fisticuffs between the locals and the people from out of town. So there was going to be a big Grateful Dead concert, the first Grateful Dead concert in New York City. The first Grateful Dead concert free, and the first Grateful Dead concert in the band shell in Tompkins Park. And people thought maybe there's going to be more fighting, so we decided we would give away a pound of pot and joints. And peace spread across the park, because it turned out to be the one thing that united everybody against the police, marijuana. And it was a wonderful chemistry, because the hippies knew some people from California, and there was still pot coming into California, which could bring the pot for much cheaper, and they could sell it to the Puerto Ricans. And the Puerto Ricans all of a sudden were getting this really great deal that the Italians would not give them. So that led to us having smoke-ins every week, and eventually I got arrested for LSD because somebody got me to sell them my personal stash of LSD, and it went to a narc, and I had to leave town. Well, they did the last thing they asked me to do was join the Yippies. I joined the Yippies, but I did not go to Chicago. But in Chicago, of course, they provoked the election of Richard Nixon, which, this thing about casting blame is a real problem, because, sometimes things just happen and nobody is to blame. But I told Abby's brother, much later, after Abby was dead, that the real problem was the drug war, not the Vietnam War, because eventually they disenfranchised enough black people by convicting them for drugs, so they had 1 million felons in Florida in 2000, the year 2000, of course. W won that election by 300 votes. So without the war on drugs, there would have been no contest. But what happened here was these guys end up, we end up doing a smoke-in, the first marijuana smoke-in in Washington, D.C. In the year 1970. And this is right after Kent State, and people said, you're going to get killed. And we said, no, we're not going to get killed, because they'd have to shoot all the tourists who are waiting for the fireworks. And so we ended up stopping Honor America Day, which was Nixon's made-up event that he was trying to make up to keep us from having our event. And there weren't very many people at Honor America Day because it was very, very hot. It was like 100 degrees. And all of our people were shirtless, just, in short pants, shorts. And somebody said, they're harassing people down at the reflecting pool. So we went running down to the reflecting pool, and the cops had a line on either side of the reflecting pool, but people just jumped to the reflecting pool and marched right up to where Billy Graham was giving a speech and shut him down. So that was a total success. And that was like basis for legitimacy of marijuana as an issue equal to Vietnam. And there were people saying, you got to like put everything on hold for Vietnam. This is overwhelming and it's so important. But we still had the first demonstration ever on national television.
Back here at the Democrats' convention in the convention hall in Miami Beach, where tonight they nominate their candidate for the presidency.
We've been advised that George McGovern is appearing.
This is David Shoemaker. George McGovern has just come downstairs.
We're in the lobby of the Doral Hotel. There is a crowd here of several hundred.
I make a flat pledge that if I become the president of the United States, every American soldier, every American prisoner, every American now involved in the war in Southeast Asia, every bomber will quit flying, all American military aid to General Pew will cease, and I don't have the slightest doubt that within 90 days of my inauguration, every American troop and every American soldier will be home. That's the pledge I make.
This scene is being watched all over Miami Beach and out at the Plano Park, and if it goes on too long, of course, it will certainly draw people. They're shouting down marijuana. There was a question about the legalization of marijuana.
I do not believe in sending anybody to the penitentiary for the use of marijuana. I'm not prepared to advocate the complete legalization of marijuana.
Les Asman.
The Central Intelligence Agency and the opium trade between Laos, Thailand, Saigon, and Formosa. We've been doing research into this for 2 years. So 2 years before we even get it into Congress. We have great reads of documented proof that the Nixon administration is actually covering up the second major source of heroin in the world, or in the United States. Now, my brother sent you a letter. Where she asked about this. Now said it wasn't true. How can you expect to have credibility if you're going to cover up like the other people?
Because I was the first, and I believe the only member
He confirms
of the
it.
United States Senate to make the charge publicly that I thought South Vietnamese officials were conniving in the heroin traffic. And I demand that an investigation be conducted to see whether any American or any official in the government of South Vietnam that we were backing was involved in the heroin trade. I even made the charge. I believe that
There's 34 million people in this country, according to law, who smoke marijuana occasionally. How will we protect these people from hard drugs if marijuana cannot be controlled like alcohol is? If we can't have some of pusher, we can send them why? Because he knows that's harmless. How can we protect them from the other?
What if you can't get marijuana from anybody except someone who deals coke? So McGovern did not use the fact that Nixon's policies were leading to a big upsurge in heroin, because the connection wasn't made to the Hmong army in Laos. There was 20,000 people in this army. They were all being paid for. You must have seen the movie Air America with Mel Gibson, where they're like flying the heroin in to Vietnam, where it gets put into the body bags and shipped back. The highest level member of the armed forces was a master sergeant. That's the highest level person that was actually convicted. But they were actually importing heroin in the bodies, in the body bags, coming back, which is pretty gruesome. And they were like paying for a secret army that wasn't even supposed to be there. If he had like maybe campaigned on that, he could have done a bit better, but I don't think he had a choice. Once he selected Eagleton as his vice president, because it was revealed that Eagleton had shock therapy. And people just lost faith in McGovern's smarts when it came to picking people. It was real basic. And, of course, I was then blamed for the next 10 years for Richard Nixon winning the election, which makes absolutely no sense. But the problem is that there was a group of, like, Democratic Party young kids who were coming up there, like Hillary and Bill Clinton, who really believed the thing that, like, ruined McGovern's chances was identification with the counterculture. Do you remember acid, amnesty, and abortion? Or peace, pot, and prosperity? These were all supposed to be platform planks of McGovern, if you listen to Richard Nixon. And they just got into this thing of we can't have any association with drugs. So when she really needed to say a few things pro-pot, ultimately Hillary was so scared that she just was completely silent on the pot issue. And I think she lost in Florida, and pot got 73%. So pot is doing way better than the politicians. Anyway, what happened was that they passed the Controlled Substances Act, and they put pot in Schedule 1 supposedly because they couldn't figure out what to do with it, and they were waiting on the Schaefer Commission report. But Nixon said the American people will never accept the stuff that's in this report. They will never accept the recommendation to allow adult personal use. And he filed the report in the wastebasket. So I always felt that he was going to be like really exposed further, either the drug thing or the JFK assassination, because we were closing in on the Watergate burglars as being connected to the assassination. And there was a cottage industry and underground papers all over the country that was getting the word out. And then when he resigned, people moved on to other stuff. Then, Vietnam fell because Nixon wasn't there to send people back. And this whole other world emerged where the country kind of went far to the left for a while. And some stuff that you'd expect more to be under Obama was happening. I think the Democrats had their greatest majority. He resigned in August, and they got their greatest majority ever in the House in November. So that there was a Republican, Ford, was still president, but they had stuff like the Olson family came forward and said that our father was murdered, fed LSD, and they pushed him out of a window. And they had to apologize. Ford had to give these people a bunch of money. And then there were hearings on Capitol Hill into things like MK Ultra and the CIA crown jewels under Frank Church. All this was happening while Ford supposedly was going to have complete transparency. We're not going to do stuff like Richard Nixon anymore. So they had to have a fair amount of transparency. And what happened was that this guy came up named Jimmy Carter. And I was a little paranoid of Jimmy Carter, to tell you the truth. We had this story about the Allman Brothers Band giving a lot of concerts for Carter after turning in some people for coke. And it turned out that the son of like Carter was into coke, and somehow he had to get busted, but it was intervened in, and he got off. So I said the problem is marijuana and cocaine are different. Cocaine is kind of salacious. It's involved with sleaze, and pot is pretty benign. We can get another Democrat like a Udall that's pro-pot that doesn't have this association with coke. But a lot of people wanted to legalize coke, so that was what happened. Was they started Norcal, which was for coke. And this is Keith Stroop, who was the guy who actually pretty much engineered the Schaefer report. So when he got, Carter in his corner, he was able to look forward to an entree at the White House. And there was a period of time where the anti-pot people couldn't get in the White House, right? And the only people who could get in were Normal. The problem was Normal didn't really have a strategy. His strategy was to get like 30 grams of pot to be legal. That was their only strategy. So we had a smoke-in at the White House, and it turned out to be really big. And if I had to do it over again, I would have done a better job on this film. This was for Centerfold ad in High Times got this.
We do have 3 separate marijuana decriminalization proposals currently sitting in the Congress. Now that's important. We want to see those bills passed. But the important thing is that to make sure your Congress knows that 10 grams of marijuana is not enough. 10 grams won't do it.
So this is a movie that me and Howard Lotsoff made, and Howard Lotsoff was a film student. Let's always remember that the thing we did right before we started the Ibogaine project was a movie about marijuana. So in a way, it was the marijuana movement that came up with Ibogaine. It's really hot because it's the 4th of July. So what happened was we were basically told to put everything on hold, all other kinds of protests about other drugs, until we can get this law passed, and that we were going to have legal pot by 1978, was what we were told. Well, the guy on the left is Peter Bourne. And Peter Bourne was the White House drug czar. He was a drugs advisor. He was a British guy who was into harm reduction, and his main interest was opiates. He wasn't even a pot guy. But the problem was he'd been snorting coke with Christy Hefner and Keith Stroop at a party, in a normal party, and Ben Maisel brought guy who had been a student reporter for the Cardinal newspaper, the Wisconsin State, the university student paper, Cardinal, who was now working for Jack Anderson. Jack Anderson was a pretty straight-laced guy. He was a Mormon. So, the reporter observed that people were smoking or snorting coke out of little snifters about the size of a half of what do you call the thing where you have? Well, anyway, there's a tiny little snifter, and you could hardly see it. You had to be spying, but they were spying, and this guy went away with this chip of information. And the problem was that Stroop did not understand how politics works, and he wanted to blackmail the White House. So he actually confirmed the story. And nothing would have happened except that Peter Bourne wrote a script for Quaaludes under a fake name and gave it to a White House staffer who went out to Virginia and was stopped by a Virginia pharmacy inspector who discovered that it was a fake name. And then there was a problem. You see, it wouldn't have... That in itself wouldn't have led to the fall of progressive drug policy, but when you added that to the story that was planted, Peter Bourne resigned in disgrace. And Normal got the reputation of the government of being a snitch. A lot of people in Normal got really, really upset and kicked Keith Stroop out. The guys from Amorphia that started it and some other people made him go be the head of the Defense Lawyers Association for 10 years or something. And by the time 1979 rolled around, this guy was not only such history, but they had a new person in named Joe Califano, who was kind of drugs was specifically now under the DEA. Only the DEA had a say. But they had guys in the Health and Human Services who were really anti-pot also, who considered marijuana to be really, really deadly drug. And of course, they didn't have the information. They're just their opinion. But, Normal had burned down its relation. And the people in Normal reacted by saying, we're not going to deal with any other drugs other than pot. We're going to protect ourselves against the cocaine thing. So, you see, since DPA didn't exist, the Drug Policy Alliance didn't exist, Drug Policy Foundation didn't exist for another, 8 to 10 years, there was nobody doing those issues of the other drugs. It was just a pot movement, period. Which kind of leaves you at a disadvantage because there's a lot of other drugs out there, and you've got to have a position on them. Anyway, you recognize these guys? Well, let me see here. I don't really have it. I don't have my laser pointer. But the guy on the left is Roy Cohn. The guy on the right is Steve Rubel, the owner of Studio 54. And he, of course, turned out to have income tax evasion problems. And in 1979, these guys cooked up a story that they had seen. This guy up here, who's with Carter, is Hamilton Jordan. He visited Studio 54, which is in the middle. Okay, you guys see real good on the left? That's a moon with a spoon. And there's a little guy down there who's servicing it. So you see the size of the moon with the spoon. It was big. And they're basically saying you can stay up all night here and snort coke and dance. And everybody who was anybody was there. I mean, John Lennon was there. There was all kinds of people at Studio 54 that were really famous. So they concocted a story. The guy in the middle, by the way, of course, is Donald Trump. And he got Steve Rubel, Roy Cohn as a lawyer. Donald Trump had become a soulmate. He was deeply channeling Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn had a second life after being a prosecutor and counsel to the committee in 1954. He became a fixer, and he was retained by Trump and his father in 1973 because they were being sued under civil rights law for refusing to rent to black people. And Cohn was so aggressive that he won. So he was a great lawyer, and Trump got him as a lawyer for Rubel, and Cohn came up with the idea of saying that Jody Powell and Hamilton Jordan were snorting coke at Studio 54. So this triggered a special prosecutor, and it was like, right now they have a special prosecutor. Nobody knows what he's going to do, but there's a cloud hanging over. So this cloud was hanging over for a long time and created the impression that there's a Jimmy Carter coke scandal going on, and a lot of that stuff never really went away. So it set things up for a complete reversal when you got a person who came in and said, I'm going to be really anti-drug and clean up America, right? Now, this probably actually belongs one slide earlier. I will change the slide because this is actually a 1978 slide, and that was a 1979 slide. But this is Dennis Peron and Harvey Milk. And of course, Harvey Milk, was like the Martin Luther King of the gay movement, and he's assassinated foully by a fired cop who was upset that he couldn't get his job back as city councilman or board of supervisors. And that much is known. It's in the standard history. My brother made the movie Milk. Okay, he did the set design on it. What people usually don't correlate is that this was a very important weekend because it wasn't just that they assassinated the future Democratic governor of California so that a Republican would get in. That was the mayor of San Francisco. They had Jonestown happen. I think the way it worked was first they had the assassination of the mayor and Harvey Milk. Then they had Jonestown. Then Tom Forsyth blew his head off in New York. So we lost High Times. High Times passed to much less creative people. The left was smeared with Jonestown, which, this guy, Jim Jones, had been involved in actual housing protests in San Francisco before he took everybody off to the woods in Suriname or wherever they went. They go to Venezuela. I'm not exactly sure. What? Ghana, right? No, not Ghana. Not Africa. Guinea. Well, the point is that this whole thing of drink the Kool-Aid became a meme, and the theory was that if you got involved with left-wing social groups, you might be taken over by a cult. Now, actually, the way I experienced it was that the cults tended to prey on the left, on the social movements, and suck people off for the 14-year-old perfect master or something. But still, it took a while for Jonestown to dissipate. So that 1, 2, 3 punch, it really, it followed up, was another shock coming right after Peter Bourne was fired, but before the stuff about the Carter Coke scandal that kind of set things up for a fairly massive change after Ronald Reagan. or after Ronald Reagan became president. Now, the other thing, remember I was talking about how when there's a right-wing lurch, some assassination happens? Well, in this case, there were two, except one of them didn't succeed. John Lennon was assassinated by a crazy Christian who said that he had dissed Jesus by saying the Beatles are bigger than Jesus, which he never should have said, but, he didn't deserve to die for that. And Ronald Reagan himself was assassinated. People tend to forget that. The bullet did not explode. It was right next to his heart. Crazy guy trying to impress Jodie Foster. He was going to actually assassinate Carter first. He didn't really have a thing against Reagan personally, just that Reagan was president. And Reagan rebounded from it and became enormously popular because he was the guy you couldn't kill. I remember it the other way around. I remember General Electric Theater. I remember the old prospector that used to come on and introduce the General Electric Theater, and then after one season he was replaced by this movie star guy, Ronald Reagan. And I always thought Reagan got rid of the old prospector. I never trusted the guy because, what happened to the old prospector? And what happened to all the other people that Reagan did it? So I didn't like him at all, but he became president. The first thing they did was they had to just say no. And Nancy Reagan, but you probably don't know who that is with Nancy Reagan. And I will tell you who that is. That is Gabriel Nahas. See, remember there was this German kind of pseudoscientist named Strengaris, who was their drugs expert. And they had the theory about the time dilation and the jazz. He had to flee and hide for 8 years, from 1945 to 1953. And then there was a right-wing government that came into power in Greece because they fought the communist insurgency and won. And he was able to surface. And he went back to teaching about marijuana. And his biggest student was a guy named Gabriel Nahas, who did not have a background as a Nazi. He had a background as a conservative part of the French resistance. But he was an Egyptian guy who really, really hated pot. And what he told my friend was, we have to keep it from getting legal, because if it ever becomes legal, they'll find out it's harmless. If they find out it's harmless, we'll never be able to make it back to being illegal again. And what he did was to commission a number of studies for the United Nations. All the claims about pot grows breasts on women, marijuana kills brain cells, all the stuff, that was gist of the Prohibition mill that was in those reports. And they became available starting in 1975, just when the Senate in the United States needed to stop Keystrup's various legalization bills. And this is the guy who was the head of the UN, I think, from 71 to the beginning of the 80s. His name is Kurt Waldheim. He was, of course, named as a Nazi war criminal when he was running for president of Austria. And, of course, they said, but everybody was a Nazi war criminal. So he became president of Austria, but nobody would talk to him. His wife, or not his wife, his daughter, named Lieselot Waldheim, became the head of the UN Narcotics Bureau in the 80s. So once again, the United States was a reliable partner. The UN was reliably fascist, and they would not talk to anybody who was pro-pot. They just would basically give them the cold shoulder. Such people couldn't even get in, anybody connected with normal couldn't talk to Nancy Reagan or anybody in the Reagan White House. Until 1988, it wasn't possible. The thing is that when Ronald Reagan was elected, me and Howard Lotsoff, the guy that made the movie that you saw a little clip of, sat down, and we'd had like a big fight with some people who were into heroin chic. And we said that heroin is not chic, and that it is not the next big thing in the pot movement. And we know about it from the 60s, and it causes overdose and death. And we decided, since we had like literally junkies crashing on the couch, were overrun, to begin an Ibogaine project, because we knew that it wasn't going to be possible to legalize pot in 18 months with Nancy Reagan in. And anyway, we were looking for something like this Vietnam heroin thing to happen all over again, because these guys have a pattern. And once they get in, they were going to deal drugs. And of course, it turned out not to be heroin from Vietnam. It turned out to be cocaine from Nicaragua, or actually Honduras, where they were landing the planes on an island. And this is Oliver North, who was a huge drug dealer, actually. When it came up before Congress, Inouye said, I don't want to besmirch the reputation of the U.S. Armed Forces. I refuse to let you talk about this. But at the end of the report that John Kerry did, it confirms they were moving tons of heroin, and it came out later, not tons of heroin, tons of cocaine, and it came out later again, all over again, in the San Jose Mercury, and the stuff about Freeway of Rick Ross bringing, the beginning of the crack explosion to L.A. So we knew it was going to happen. We just didn't know exactly the details.